Not a public one, not something announced from palace balconies or whispered through official statements, but something colder, sharper, far more deliberate. A sudden, almost surgical movement behind the walls of power, where access was restricted, files were flagged, and doors that were once quietly open were sealed without explanation. Because the moment Prince Harry made his latest move, something inside the palace snapped into action, and insiders said this wasn't damage control, this was containment. Because what Harry did this time wasn't loud, it was precise, calculated, and according to those watching closely, it crossed a line the institution had been silently protecting for years, a line no one was supposed to touch, a line buried deep inside archived documents, sealed correspondences, and sensitive records that were never meant to become part of any public narrative, and yet somehow something shifted, something moved, something was triggered, and within hours the palace wasn't reacting, it was securing. And that word securing became everything, because suddenly files weren't just files anymore, they were risks, they were vulnerabilities, they were pieces of a puzzle that if connected could expose far more than a family dispute. And sources close to the situation describe a chilling sequence, late-night internal calls, restricted access protocols, digital trails being reviewed, physical archives being rechecked, and a quiet but unmistakable instruction passed down through inner circles. Nothing sensitive leaves, nothing questionable remains accessible, nothing that can be twisted becomes visible. Because whatever Harry was about to do next, the palace was no longer willing to wait and see. This wasn't about statements anymore. This was about control. And the panic? It didn't come from headlines. It came from what wasn't being said. Because behind the silence, something far more intense was unfolding. Something hinted at in fragmented whispers. Something buried in documents that insiders now suggest had been flagged long before this moment. Files that carried legal weight, historical relevance, and personal implications so complex that even discussing them openly could destabilize narratives that had been carefully maintained for years. And when Harry's move suggested, even indirectly, that he might be willing to bring certain truths into the light, the reaction was immediate. Secure everything. Lock it down. No chances. Because what if he already had something? That question alone was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Because this wasn't the first time tensions had risen, but it was the first time the response looked like preparation rather than reaction, like the palace wasn't just defending itself, it was anticipating exposure, anticipating a chain reaction that could spiral beyond control if even one piece slipped through. And that's when the phrase started circulating internally, quietly, almost cautiously. Containment strategy. Not official, not confirmed, but repeated enough to feel real. Because containment isn't about winning, it's about limiting damage. And suddenly, everything started to look different. Why were certain communications going silent? Why were certain individuals no longer being looped into discussions? Why did routine processes suddenly require additional clearance? Because when an institution that thrives on tradition suddenly shifts into restriction, it's not random, it's intentional. And it always means something bigger is at stake. Meanwhile, Harry wasn't speaking. Not publicly, not directly. But that silence, it wasn't empty, it was loaded. Because insiders suggest his move wasn't about noise, it was about positioning, about placing something into motion that didn't need immediate explanation. Something that could sit, wait, and apply pressure without ever needing to be shouted from a headline, and that's what made it dangerous. Because the palace couldn't respond to what wasn't fully visible, couldn't counter what wasn't fully revealed, and couldn't ignore what might already be circulating behind the scenes. And that's when the real tension began. Because while the palace was securing files, reviewing documents, tightening access, Harry was doing something far more unpredictable. He was holding his position. No dramatic interviews, no sudden revelations, just stillness. And sometimes stillness is louder than anything else because it forces everyone else to move first. And the palace did. Quietly, strategically, methodically. Sensitive files flagged. Internal records reviewed. Archived materials secured. Not deleted, not erased, but protected, isolated, placed beyond reach. Because if there was even a possibility that something could be taken out of context, misinterpreted, or weaponized, it wasn't going to be left exposed. And that level of response doesn't come from speculation, it comes from fear of what might already be known. And here's where it gets even more intense. Because the phrase sensitive files files doesn't just mean documents, it means history. It means decisions. It means moments that were never meant to be questioned. And if Harry's move even hinted at revisiting any of that, then this wasn't just a personal conflict anymore. This was institutional. Because once history is opened, it doesn't close quietly. And the palace knows that better than anyone. So instead of waiting, instead of risking, instead of hoping nothing happens, they acted. They secured everything. And that action alone tells a story. Because institutions don't panic publicly. They panic privately, through restrictions, through silence, through sudden, unexplained shifts in behavior that only make sense when you realize something bigger is unfolding behind the scenes. And right now, something is unfolding. Because if there was nothing to protect, nothing would need to be secured. If there was no risk, there would be no containment. If there was no threat, there would be no panic. But there is. And the most unsettling part? We still don't know exactly what triggered it. We only see the reaction. We only feel the shift. We only hear the whispers. And sometimes the reaction is the biggest clue of all. And what makes this even more unsettling is that the deeper you look into the reaction, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't a sudden decision. It was something prepared, something planned for, something waiting for the exact moment when it would need to be activated. Because institutions like the palace don't improvise under pressure. They anticipate it. They build quiet contingencies for scenarios they hope never happen. And when those scenarios begin to take shape, the response is not chaotic. It is precise, layered, and almost eerily calm on the surface, even while everything underneath is shifting at high speed. Because while the world outside is still trying to understand what exactly Prince Harry did, what really matters is how the palace interpreted it, and according to those closest to the situation, the interpretation was immediate and serious, not because of what was publicly visible, but because of what it implied. Because sometimes a move isn't dangerous for what it reveals, it's dangerous for what it suggests might come next. And whatever Harry set into motion created just enough uncertainty to trigger a full internal lockdown of anything that could become a liability if pulled into the wrong narrative. And this is where things take a darker turn, because the securing of sensitive files wasn't just about protection, it was about containment of potential narratives. Because in a world where perception can be shaped as quickly as information can be leaked, controlling access becomes the first line of defense, and suddenly access itself became restricted in ways that insiders describe as unprecedented, with long-standing informal channels going silent, trusted intermediaries being temporarily sidelined, and even internal discussions being reduced to smaller, tightly controlled circles where every word, every detail, every document was treated as if it could one day be exposed. Because that's the fear now. That exposure is no longer hypothetical. It's possible. And once something becomes possible, it becomes real enough to act on. At the same time, the silence from the palace wasn't just strategic, it was deliberate. Because speaking too soon, responding too directly, or even acknowledging the tension could open doors that are currently sealed. And so instead of statements, there is stillness. Instead of explanations, there is control. And instead of confrontation, there is quiet preparation. The kind that happens when an institution decides it will not be caught off guard again. And yet, what makes this situation even more volatile is the unpredictability of the other side. Because Harry is no longer operating within the traditional boundaries of the system he once belonged to, he is outside it, observing it, understanding it, and according to some, possibly holding pieces of it that were never meant to leave its walls. And whether those pieces are documents, conversations, or simply knowledge, the effect is the same. They create pressure, they create tension, and they force the palace to move carefully. Because one wrong move could turn speculation into confirmation. And confirmation is what they cannot afford. Because once something is confirmed, it can no longer be managed quietly. It becomes public, it becomes permanent, and it becomes uncontrollable. That's why the phrase game-changing twist isn't just dramatic, it reflects something real happening beneath the surface. Because the dynamic has shifted, the balance has changed, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like the palace isn't just managing a situation, it's containing it, limiting its reach, minimizing its impact before it fully emerges. And that kind of response only happens when the stakes are no longer just personal, but structural. Because this is no longer just about disagreements or interviews or past grievances. It's about what could be revealed, what could be interpreted, what could be questioned. And once those questions start forming publicly, they don't disappear, they multiply, they evolve, and they begin to challenge narratives that have stood unchallenged for years. And the palace knows that. So it prepares, it secures, it controls. Because control is the only thing standing between stability and chaos. And yet, despite despite all of this preparation, despite all of this containment, there is one thing they cannot fully control: the timing. Because if Harry chooses to act, to speak, to release something, to shift the narrative in a way that forces the palace into the open, then all of these quiet measures, all of these secured files, all of this careful planning will be tested in real time, under real pressure, with real consequences, and that is the moment they are trying to delay, trying to prevent, trying to outmaneuver before it even arrives. But here's the truth that makes everything feel even more intense: the moment might already be closer than anyone realizes. Because movements like this don't happen in isolation, they build, they escalate, they lead somewhere, and if this truly is a containment strategy, then it means the palace believes something is coming, something significant enough to justify locking down its most sensitive material, something serious enough to trigger internal protocols that are rarely, if ever, activated, and that alone changes everything. Because when an institution prepares for impact, it's usually because it expects one. And now, the question isn't whether something is happening, it's what exactly is about to be revealed. Because whatever it is, it's already powerful enough to cause panic behind closed doors, already serious enough to trigger silent operations, and already dangerous enough to make the palace move before the world even understands why. And when the reaction comes before the revelation, it usually means one thing: this story isn't over, it's just getting started.